Good evening. I'm Mark Madison. I'm the historian for the Fish and Wildlife Service and also run the public lecture series out here. So thanks for coming out on this lovely evening. So I'd like to welcome you to the Conservation Lecture Series, the oldest conservation lecture series to serve free coffee for 25 years. And tonight it's totally appropriate that a historian is introducing our speaker because Lowell Baier is somebody who's had a huge impact on environmental history. He's had a 60-year career that's taken him amazingly from practicing attorney to an entrepreneur to a tireless advocate for natural resources and wildlife conservation. And finally, he's reached his peak as an environmental historian and author. Quite an author. In the early 70s, Baier was one of the original 14 founders of the Wild Sheep Foundation, which helped reestablish historically extant habitat for 4 species of wild sheep in North America and eventually led to similar programs in Russia and Mongolia. Since 1975, Lowell's been active in the Boone and Crockett Club, our nation's actually oldest environmental organization, started by Theodore Roosevelt way back in 1887, and he's President Emeritus. He's advised elected officials and presidents ever since George H.W. Bush's wildlife conservation agenda in 1989, and somehow, in between saving sheep and advising presidents, he's written an insane number of books, all of which are very rich. His 3 most recent books are pictured above. He's written a trilogy on the Endangered Species Act, which just celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, in which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service helps maintain and helps monitor and regulate. So please give a very warm West Virginia welcome to Lowell Baier.
Well, thank you, Mark. And hello to all of you here. And Mark tells me 8,000 people that watch this this program through their computers. Before I begin, I'm just curious, how many of you, I'd like to see a show of hands, how many of you have either read the Endangered Species Act, worked with it, or have some knowledge of it? Well, that's a good number. That's a great number. I'm glad to hear that. I've spent the last 6 years researching and writing the past and the future histories of the 1973 Endangered Species Act. And the result was a 2-volume work entitled The Codex of the Endangered Species Act, Volume 1, the first 50 years, and The Codex of the Endangered Species Act, Volume 2, the next 50 years. And they were released last fall. Now, because they're very dense and academic, going minutely into the details and all of the sections of the Endangered Species Act, the publisher asked me to do a layman's abridged version of these 2 books. And as I started reviewing my research notes, having interviewed between 75 and 100 people over a 6 or 7 year period, I realized that there was a major backstory of implementing the 73 law. And the stories I heard included sex, drugs, violence, a lot of violence, fistfights, perjury, jail time, murder, suicide, and lawsuits, and vigorous dissent, all spawned by this new federal law that invaded the historic domain and jurisdiction of the states over their resident wildlife, which immediately raised a constitutional rights question. So that was the origin of Volume 3, which is this one over here. These are the first two on this side. It raised that constitutional question. And so that was the origin of really the 3 books. And the last book was entitled Earth's Emergency Room, this little one here. Earth's Emergency Room, Saving Species as the Planet and Politics Get Hotter. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me go back to the beginning when this country began to deal with endangered species and species extinction. It began in the 1970s by a cadre of men that included George Bird Grinnell, Theodore Roosevelt, C. Hart Merriman, William Hornaday, and many, many others. Buffalo, antelope, and deer were nearing extinction, along with other animals. And there were certain species of birds, like the passenger pigeon, that was growing extinct. Without game laws, seasons, and bag limits, it was exacerbated by rapacious market hunters supplying fresh game to our urban eastern cities. Sanctuaries and game refuges were established, and the laws passed by a few of the men I just mentioned to repropagate these species' dwindling populations. After a decade of federal intervention and preemption in all aspects of our American life, cradle to grave, it wasn't surprising that in 1966, 1969, and 1973, that the federal government inserted itself into the National Endangered Species Dialogue. And they breached, in doing so, the state's historic sovereign authority over wildlife that goes back to the founding of this country. The only other wildlife laws that infringed on states' rights was the Lacey Act of 1900 and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 that governed the taking of migratory waterfowl and neotropical birds. Protecting endangered species fell within the federal government's province of protecting the public interest under the public trust doctrine, because it was such a broad national issue beyond the state's capacity to address, and within federal jurisdiction primarily under the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Recognition of many species in crisis became a growing national debate early in the Green Revolution between 1960 and 1980. These included all of the whales of the ocean, condors, whooping cranes, grizzly and polar bears, black-footed ferrets, striped and spotted cats, the American alligator, and wolves, just to name a few. Back then, major disasters were routinely occurring throughout the United States that you'll remember. Air and water quality had deteriorated. Faulty consumer products were being manufactured, and our citizens' health and safety was threatened, and their quality of life. 67 environmental and consumer product laws were enacted between 1960 and 1980. And just a few of the environmental laws included the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA, the Wild Horses and Burros Act, 3 Endangered Species Acts, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Also created during this 20-year window was the White House Council on Environmental Quality, known as CEQ, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, and the Department of Environmental Protection, known as the EPA. Now, I was in law school when the Green Revolution started back in the 60s, and I participated early on in campus events and protests during this robust period of developing national interests and concerns about the environment, which were driving it throughout the country. It intensified with each catastrophe that you'll remember. 3 Mile Island, Love Canal, the Santa Barbara oil spill, the Cuyahoga River up in Ohio catching on fire for the 13th time because of petroleum waste, leather tanning, and sawmill waste were being dumped into it. It caught on fire 13 times throughout the 1900s and before that. President John F. Kennedy gave leadership to address the angst of America, followed by Lyndon Johnson. Rachel Carson's several books, concluding with Silent Spring, became a national voice for many. All of this amidst the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. America had a lot to deal with, and I wonder how the Congress achieved 67 well-thought-out environmental and consumer protection laws enacted between 1960 and 1980. And I watched many of them and participated throughout the debates on many of these laws on Capitol Hill. Douglas Brinkley's book, who spoke here recently, The Silent Spring Revolution, John Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the Great Environmental Awakening, was released last year. And for those of you that have a curiosity about the history of that period, it's a fascinating read. Doug is a good friend of mine. I proofread part of it as he was writing it, and it's a terrific book. Now, during this period, 3 Endangered Species Acts were passed. The first in 1966, which was really an aspirational policy statement without any real enforcement and mechanism built into it. The second Endangered Species Act, passed in 1969, which prohibited the import of endangered species from abroad. The dire potential extinction of animals mentioned earlier, whales, polar bears, grizzly bears, wolves, and so forth, got the attention of the public and the Congress to enact the 66 and 69 ESA laws. But they weren't comprehensive enough and didn't have the teeth needed to address this growing extinction crisis. A friend of mine, a frustrated Democratic congressman from Dearborn, Michigan, by the name of John D. Dingell Jr., who championed the 66 and 69 bills, introduced a bill in 1972 that addressed the weaknesses of the 2 existing laws. President Nixon recognized the growing and identifiable green vote, and so his administration followed John's lead and introduced a Republican version of the bill. After extensive hearings in both the House and Senate in 1972, both the Republican administration and the Democratic Congress rewrote their 72 versions of the bill, and in early 1973, reintroduced them, and extensive hearings were again held in 73 as they were throughout 72. 2 different versions of the bill were approved. They went to a conference committee, and a compromise bill was finally approved almost unanimously in both the houses and sent to President Nixon, who signed it on December 28, 1973. Now, the popular media story and soundbite is Congress thought it applied only to big, charismatic animals, megafauna, like whales, polar and grizzly bears, condors, etc. Members of Congress later used that story as cover when the fireworks started in 1978 because of a Supreme Court decision, the first major piece of legislation on the ESA. Now, I've read every word of the congressional floor discussions committee hearings and reports, proposed amendments, and the final conference report over this 2-year period. And there is no question in my mind, no question, that Congress fully understood its broad reach and implications. But they still hid behind the media soundbite of, oh, gee, this was only for big charismatic animals. Now, throughout the dialogue during 1972 and 73 in Congress, the words, quote, moral imperative and, quote, ethical responsibility were used frequently in the congressional debates. They characterized the existing extinction situation as, quote, a moral insensitivity to life and, quote, ecological myopia. Enactment of the ESA was in, quote, the best interest of mankind because, quote, we are tinkering with our own futures and need, quote, to protect man from himself. We cannot destroy what we cannot replace. Quote, greed and our blind desire for progress has enabled us to interrupt the balance and rhythm of nature. And, quote, extinction is quite literally a fate worse than death. Now, these words illustrate the mind and intent of Congress, one of complete bipartisanship and dedication to the public interest. The Congress prioritized the public's future over commercial progress and greed, in contrast to today's Congress. The ESA was the result of a Democratic Congress and a Republican administration, bipartisanship, contrasted with today's divisiveness of brinkmanship and partisanship. The thoroughness with which the members of both the House and Senate subcommittees, main overview committees, reviewed and examined the successive drafts, amendments, and technical changes to the endangered species bills over a 2-year period is a vivid example of how Congress worked following World War II. Each member took their job seriously and applied themselves to lawmaking in the national interest as their top priority, and not fundraising and re-election. After World War II and the defeat of the totalitarian Nazi regime, preserving our democracy and historic system of self-governance and lawmaking was of paramount concern to our elected congressmen and senators. Their approach was practical and pragmatic, not partisan in intent. While there was a detailed debate over the ESA's many parts in Congress, the biggest issue, the very biggest issue, the main issue that they really struggled over was state sovereignty and control over the resident wildlife of the states versus federal control. Who would have the final say of what species were threatened or endangered and should be listed, and making a critical habitat designation? And who would manage its recovery? In a word, who had primacy, the last word? The states, especially the states west of the 100th meridian, reacted violently to this proposed federal intervention. Alaska's Republican Senator Ted Stevens, right down to the last day and last hour, argued states should maintain primacy. And John Dingell said it should be the federal government. Now, the key words that they debated was state concurrence in all key decisions versus only state consultation. Concurrence versus consultation, two different concepts. Consultation won out, but the states carried the burden of managing listed species recovery under rigid federal standards and guidelines. Congress, however, failed to recognize all the costs of recovering a species then and now, and funding has been the ESA's Achilles heel for 50 years. The primacy debate between states' rights and the federal government, moreover, remain the root of tension between the federal government and the states still to this day. Now, there have been only 3 major amendments to the ESA and 3 minor technical amendments over the many years. The first major 1978 amendment created what was known as the God Squad, which could exempt specific federal projects from jurisdiction of the ESA. The God Squad has met only twice. The 3 major amendments, 1978, 1982, and 88, made many clarifications to the law, which are too numerous and involved to detail tonight. Briefly, however, they entailed defining what critical habitat is and how it should be designated and implemented. They required the development of recovery plans for listed species at risk. They added plants to the ESA. They mandated a 5-year review of all listed species, both during listing and after they were delisted. And the experimental populations were authorized that, for example, was used to put wolves into Yellowstone National Park. And the Congress created flexibility for landowners in devising conservation and management plans for listed species, which made it easier for landowners to live with in the constraints of the ESA. Now, these are just a few of the major highlights of this, but the language that they put in to allow more flexibility for the landowners was, again, too rigid and tight. It didn't really work, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But if you're wondering why there has been no major amendments or congressional action after the 1988 amendment, it's because of partisan gridlock and the fear that because once the ESA is opened up for substantive amendments, it would open itself up to unforeseen amendments and unanticipated consequences that would weaken the act. In the last 25 years, there have been actually over 600 proposed amendments that would either weaken or repeal the act. 600 within the last 25 years. Today alone in the Congress, there are over 50 bills which have been introduced in the House attacking the ESA. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service has, since the Clinton administration, used a regulatory approach to adjust the ESA to make it work better for private sector versus asking for congressional legislation. They've gone the regulatory route. We've all given up on a polarized Congress that is all brinksmanship versus bipartisanship that enacted the ESA 50 years ago. The first major piece of litigation over the act went to the Supreme Court, who in 1978 heard the case of TVA v. Hill. The court's opinion clearly stated the intent and meaning of the act. It applied to all wildlife at risk, not just a few species, but all wildlife at risk, which could be listed as threatened or endangered of extinction. That litigation was over a 3-inch fish called the snail darter, a member of the perch family. The Tennessee Valley Authority was building the Tellico Dam that would create a reservoir on the Little Tennessee River, a very fast-flowing cold water river that was the snail darter's habitat. The snail darter would be extirpated by the dam and reservoir because, like trout, they need a fast-flowing cold water environment. It was a $116 million project, and the dam was 90% completed, having started before the 1973 Act was passed. Now, the Supreme Court's opinion, written by Chief Justice Burger, was unequivocal, totally unequivocal. And here are some quotes from his opinion, just to give you an idea of how firm the court said this law is. Quote, the plain intent of Congress in enacting the statute was to halt and reverse the trend towards species extinction. at whatever the cost. At whatever the cost. This was reflected not only in the stated policies of the Act, but in literally every section of the statute. Quote, the plain language of the Act, buttressed by its legislative history, shows clearly that Congress viewed the value of endangered species as incalculable. Quote, the legislative proceedings in 1973 are in fact replete with expressions of concern over the risk that might lie in the loss of any endangered species. As we homogenize the habitats in which these plants and animals evolved, and as we increased the pressure for products that they are in a position to supply, we threaten their and our own genetic heritage. The value of this genetic heritage is quite literally incalculable. And Justice Berger continued, quote, from the most narrow possible point of view, it's in the best interest of mankind to minimize the losses of genetic variations. The reason is simple. There are potential resources. They are potential resources. They are keys to puzzles which we cannot solve and may provide answers to questions which we have not yet learned to ask. And finally, quote, as the examples cited here demonstrate, Congress was concerned about the unknowns that the endangered species might have here and about the unforeseeable place such creatures may have in the chain of life on this planet. Justice Berger was quite adamant. The support for the ESA quickly changed as a firestorm of controversy following the Supreme Court's 78 opinion. Both sides lawyered up, not knowing what species would be listed next and their habitats declared critical, which meant future land use plans by farmers, ranchers, miners, foresters could be compromised. The ESA was attacked as a land use control measure by the federal government. The Tellico Dam was in Tennessee. Senator Howard Baker's home state. His initial response to the snail darter decision was to amend the ESA right after the law or the court made the ruling, and he created the God Squad through legislation, which, as I said earlier, could exempt a federal project from ESA jurisdiction. The God Squad, Senator Baker hoped, would exempt the Tellico Dam from the ESA. However, the God Squad voted not to do so. Ultimately, Senator Baker and the local representative, John Duncan, using congressional sleight of hand or legerdemain, slipped in a last-minute rider attached to a critical defense appropriations bill. And within 42 seconds of the discussion on the House floor, it was approved. And the $116 million Tellico Dam was then completed thereafter by 1979. Other litigation followed over the years to clarify specific language of the Act, but none as dramatic as the snail darter case, and it remains the bookend at the beginning of this history. While the Northwest spotted owl controversy became identified with the ESA, which listed the spotted owl as threatened, the owl was but a proxy for the revised Northwest Forest Plan that began to limit clear-cutting of redwoods and other trees and old-growth forests in the Northwest. Another cause reducing timber harvesting was a decreased demand for U.S. timber because of the low-cost lumber competition from South America and some Asian Pacific Rim countries. But the spotted owl became a listed species 5 years into this 10-year controversy. The spotted owl controversy went on for 10 years, but right in the middle of it, the spotted owl was listed. And it became the proxy for the angry loggers and timberland communities in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, whose livelihoods and future were threatened. And it became the soundbite for media during a decade of timber wars. That situation created, that and the Supreme Court law created a dark mythology surrounding the ESA during this period. And it's still, this dark mythology continues to still haunt it to this day. As one looks across the spectrum of 50 years of litigation, the other notable litigation was the lawsuits beginning in the mid-1990s through roughly 2015, but which continue today on a much smaller scale. In the early 90s, a series of litigious nonprofits were created to sue the federal government on environmental issues, and the ESA was their number one target. The ESA requires that when a petition is filed to list a species, the Fish and Wildlife Service must respond in 90 days and either deny the petition or say the species has a likelihood of going extinct. In that case, the Fish and Wildlife Service must, within 9 months, do a complete biological assessment and either list it as threatened or endangered of extinction, or rule that species of higher authority outweigh the listing at the present time. Now, typically, the service misses responding within 90 days or 9 months later, and these zealous, litigious NGOs lying in wait would immediately sue the very next day. The very next morning. These are called deadline suits. And the gambit during the early years was to sue and settle for an undisclosed amount of money that was never publicly reported. I changed that. We got a law passed. It took me 6 years, but we got that law passed. It goes back to the 1990s, but they now have to report. We now have public reporting again. In 2007 and 2010, respectively, the Center for Biological Diversity and the Wild Earth Guardians each filed separate petitions for a total of 1,085 separate species. It crushed the service, who had no way of reacting within 9 days or 9 months thereafter. The cases were consolidated, and the Fish and Wildlife Service agreed to a systematic work plan to respond over 6 years to each petition. That approach became the working model for addressing petitions and is used to this day. These NGO deadline suits, the snail darter and the spotted owl controversy, are the three major litigation highlights over 50 years, and the others get deep into the weeds and too many ESA issues within its reach, interpretation, enforcement, and application. Funding. The most pressing problem today is funding the cost of ESA's administration and enforcement. The 1973 Act provided that the federal government made the final decision on listing a species. But in practice, the states had most of the burden of recovering that species from the brink of extinction after listing. That required personnel and money. The federal government appropriated only $10 million per year to support the state's expenses in 1973. Folks, the Congress made a moral commitment to protect and save species, but financially underfunded it and did not stand behind their commitment to the nation's future, either then or now, today. In 2015, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies formed a blue ribbon task force to examine the growing problem of funding, and in 2016 issued a report that the states and tribes needed $1.4 billion per year to sustain their conservation and recovery efforts, both for non-listed species of greatest concern, who potentially could become listed later, and those listed as threatened or endangered of extinction. Now, the Congress has wrestled for 8 years and 5 sessions of Congress to act on this required funding. But because they haven't figured out an offset an offset to pay for this and refused annually to appropriate it out of the Treasury's general funds, i.e. the taxpayers' money. This legislation has been stymied. The act is called RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which has been stalled now for 8 years. Bruce Westerman, chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, introduced a competing bill this session entitled America's Wildlife Habitat Conservation Act, which amends the 1935 Pittman-Robertson Act and appropriates $300 million per year for 5 years to states to recover species listed under the ESA and unlisted species in crisis, and for habitat conservation and land acquisition of species of greatest conservation need. The required congressional offset to pay for this bill comes indirectly from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for programs that were authorized in these two acts. Now, if Westerman's bill ever reaches the Senate, it's dead on arrival because it really weakens the ESA and its funding is really insufficient. The next major headline following litigation about the Act's history is its initial absolute rigidity, which the Supreme Court reinforced at whatever the cost. Remember, in his opinion, he said at whatever the cost. And then the headline continues how flexibility has later developed to address the cost issue, which includes collaboration with land users affected by the ESA. Now, how and why did it start out so rigid and absolute in its language is only understood within the historical context of the era within which it was enacted, and the key players who wrote it. They were all World War II veterans with a very militaristic attitude of the federal government's role of command and control, which prevailed during World War II. Throughout the post-World War II period, during the Truman presidency, and then followed by the 8 years of General Eisenhower's presidency, followed by Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Carter, who were all veterans. This command and control mentality permeated the ESA language in its absolute primacy. It's throughout that's why it's such a tough law, because it was written by this concept of absolute primacy in controlling the administration and enforcement of the act. Moreover, its early administrators in the Fish and Wildlife Service were all veterans. Now, it took some 20 years of bitter strife and lawsuits until the Clinton administration, the first president after the war that had not seen duty, during his administration, he appointed Bruce Babbitt as his Secretary of Interior in January 1993. And he recognized this absolute rigid approach to interface with the states and private landowners wasn't working. It just wasn't working. Babbitt created a 10-point plan to amend the ESA regulations to provide the Fish and Wildlife Service with flexible policies that engage the states and the private sector with a variety of programs. That enlightened approach and engagement resulted in a collaborative approach to working together towards common solutions rather than fighting against each other, which continues to unfold every day. Still, Babbitt's vision was for there to be more ways for private landowners to work with endangered species and conserve them voluntarily, rather than face onerous regulations if they refused. He was setting out to address a perverse incentive. The ESA only protects species on your land, And if you don't have any species on your land, the ESA doesn't affect you. So what the landowners did, especially in the West, quietly and secretly removed any endangered species that lived on their land. The practice is known as shoot, shovel, and shut up. So Babbitt and his team at Interior, as well as my friends Michael Bean and Robert Bonney with the nonprofit Environmental Defense Fund, took a look at the ways to work with landowners instead of against them. And the team came up with a series of new tools codified in policies and regulations, which provided that if you had listed or canted species on your land and you did a conservation and management plan that the federal government approved, you never had to worry any further about costs or liability as long as you stuck to that plan. This series of tools and policies that eased the burden of the Endangered Species Act included the no surprises policy, canted conservation agreements with and without assurances, safe harbor agreements, and the peace policy. This initiative was hugely successful, and it's led to million acres of lands, acres of habitat, and thousands of species being protected. And as an added bonus, it addressed the political problem of the timber wars and the northern spotted owl. So that reduced conflicts around listed species. The obvious next step is if we can get landowners to care for endangered species, to ask if they can also care for all the species on their land and their habitats. So hopefully those species don't ever have to be listed in the first place. And that's the real story of what we've begun to see in the last 15 years. It's called pre-listing conservation. Pre-listing conservation. More and more landowners, corporations, government agencies, NGOs, and major donors are working on conserving species of all sorts, especially those in danger of being listed. And we've had some amazing successes keeping species like the New England cottontail and the greater sage grouse in the West off the threatened and endangered species list entirely, and reversing the decline of the red-cockaded woodpecker in the South, just to name a few. It's moreover been a part of the evolution of our collective management strategy, not only the service, but the country as well, from focusing on focusing on recovering a single species to include the watersheds around that species. Next, it was followed by a wider ecosystem within which they both exist. And today, the enlightened approach is of a landscape level conservation strategy that includes all species sharing the same geography with those that are endangered. The best example of the landscape level conservation approach is the work to sustain the sage grouse over 11 western states during the last 8 to 10 years. And it's 350 species sharing the same habitat with the sage grouse. All of this as global warming and climate change present all species with new paradigms for survival. Today, it's resulted in the public and private sector developing what we call conservation without conflict. The visionaries of this concept were 2 Fish and Wildlife Service regional directors. And today, that organization is run by a retired Fish and Wildlife Service regional director. And it's leading the way developing policies and principles for collaborative conservation. It's moreover taken the lead in promoting pre-listing conservation practices for species at risk of extinction before they become endangered to avoid listing. Collaborative and pre-listing conservation has become a revolutionary paradigm shift and sea change in the ESA world. And it all started with Secretary Bruce Babbitt's recognition in the early 1990s that absolute federal primacy and control in all decisions does not work. You've got to incorporate the public and the working landowners in these decisions, and that's finally been recognized. Now, the future, biodiversity. Biodiversity is now exacerbated by global warming and climate change, and the ESA is at its very center. Now, just so we're all on the same page, let me define biodiversity. Biodiversity is the natural world around us and the variety of all different kinds of organisms: plants, animals, insects, reptiles, crustaceans, amphibians, fish and aquatic species, and microorganisms that live on this planet, including man. It's the universe. It's the universe of all living organisms and species. Every one of these species live and work together in a diversity of ecosystems to maintain and support life on Earth, and they all exist in a delicate balance. From biodiversity, man draws his food, shelter, clothing, and medicine. That was the stated purpose of the ESA, to protect the species and the habitats that they live on. Now, most people and many scientists are still struggling to understand this triad and the interrelationship between biodiversity, climate change, and the ESA. The very core of the biodiversity crisis are species at risk of extinction. That's the core. And these are the very species the ESA is designed to protect. They're one and the same. So one could say that the ESA is the emergency room of the biodiversity crisis. Now, climate change has exacerbated and causes extinction, and hence is the third component of the triad, all tied together in a symbiotic relationship. The connection of the ESA and the biodiversity crisis that climate change adds is species and habitat loss. What species can outrun or live through catastrophic wildfires, 100 to 500 year floods, tornadoes, extreme heat and droughts? This destroyed habitat takes ages to repair, but in the meantime, species at risk go extinct. They're gone forever. For example, take the pollinators of our food and prescription drugs, which are in serious trouble. Wild bees and commercially managed honeybees in recent years have lost 45 and 48% of their populations, respectively. Monarch butterflies and related butterflies have lost 90% of their population. We've lost 9 billion birds alone in North America in the last 50 years. It's a decrease of 25% of the bird population today. Just think about the birds that you don't see anymore. Where have they gone? The ESA is the one tool we have to conserve our pollinators and prevent a major ecological crisis that threatens both our food and prescription drug supply that they pollinate. But there is hope for the future. The path to successfully navigate the biodiversity crisis confronting our planet is fourfold. One, the potential impact of conservation without conflict, working together rather than against each other. Two, increasing our pre-listing conservation efforts. Three, developing greater flexibility within ESA regulations. And four, enacting RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, that will get $1.4 billion per year into the state's conservation efforts. Even though the ESA is 50 years old, it's actually more relevant today than it was when it was enacted because of the biodiversity crisis that's developed since 1973. And in the next 50 years, it's going to be even more important than it is today because of climate change exacerbating the biodiversity crisis. So for an in-depth look at the ESA, go to a special website that I've created, and it's pretty easy to remember. It's simply ESA AT, not the little at with the circle around it, ESA at ESA50.com. ESA50.com. The histories are there, stories are there. It's a fulsome website. And so that details the 50-year history of the Act and the challenges over the next 50 years. And those are the high points that have happened in the past. So thank you for listening. Thank you.